Welcome to ND and Me, a podcast to share NDers' lived experiences.
Hi, Andrea.
Ha-
Please introduce yourself to all of our viewers and watchers.
Hello, Richard. Thanks for inviting me on to Lemonade. Is that the name of the podcast,
Well, so
Lemonade? Or
Lemonade is the business, and
yeah,
ND and Me is the podcast
okay, great.
to share the lived experiences of awesome
Yeah,
ND folk like you.
great. So, hello, I'm Andrea Anderson. I am a coach and a soon-to-be author. I discovered my autism at the age of 45, just as we were going into the first lockdown. And a kind of fairly well-known story. I discovered it through it being identified in my eldest child. And it's been life-changing for me to make this discovery, and also bewildering that it took 45 years for me to discover such a kind of large piece of information about how I function. It being withheld from me. So my talk today with you is going to be in two parts. It's how neurodivergence affected my working life before I knew about it, and how it's affected it after, and where I am on my kind of journey of acceptance. Because that's really what my book is about. It's about helping other late discovered autists to get to their own kind of form of self-acceptance and to find belonging from that place. Because I think that's what many of us have been seeking throughout most of our lives, is to kind of understand, well, who am I, and where I'm not like you, where do I fit? And I think also I'd really like to bring to the surface as well what it's like as a kind of a female, with the masking elements as well, and the bias that exists for us, and why that kind of neurodivergence being a gender inequality issue is something I'm very passionate about speaking out about in business and beyond, so that people coming through the generations behind us don't have these same kind of mental health issues or stigmas that perhaps we've had coming through workplaces.
Fab. So how old is your oldest now?
He is 11. He has just started secondary school, but his differences were very apparent from a young age. He's beautifully different and quite comfortable. He's autistic and ADHD. The ADHD bit hasn't been diagnosed as such, but he was the kind of entry point of identification that our whole family are neurodivergent. So, but I was very scared of his difference, not of him, but for him. And I ninjaed autism away from him for a really long time. And that's not very typical, because I know a lot of parents are like, look, I really think my child is kind of struggling with these aspects, whereas I thought I was being helpful in, nothing to see here, let's all just move along. Just quirky and introverted like me, and it took me to see how awful it is for him in school, how stressful and traumatic, and what that does to his body and mind, to finally realize that my misguided helpfulness at batting away difference is actually was harmful to him.
No. None of my kids are diagnosed, but some of them have definitely got traits.
Yeah,
But my nephew is 18 February.
yeah.
And he was diagnosed as soon as he started school. Yeah, there's definitely a conversation around the power of labels,
Yeah,
and the stigma frequently associated with the label, especially if you're a audacious boy.
yeah,
um, because actually these traits do show up quite differently in
yeah.
non-boys.
Definitely. And I think, I mean, it's been quite a few years of unraveling and looking at all of this. And I think I am really curious about where we're at right now with the label of neurodivergence, because for me it's been incredibly liberating, not straight away, but it's become the thing that set me free from trying to fit and trying to conform, and to really give myself space to say, actually, that's a bit much for me, or this works better for me, or do you know what? I've always wanted to be a writer, and writing is my favorite form of communication. So it's become really liberating, but in the beginning, it wasn't, and I was very scared. So it was sort of, I don't know if this is a typical for all neurodivergent people, but I often have a collision of mixed thoughts and ideas. So when I first read about how autism presents in females, it was like everything really slowed down, and I felt a bit hot and like, oh my God, this is like just like truth was leaping off the page at me. But it was a collision of fear and comfort, because it's like, wow, this is a thing. Like, other people feel like me. They struggle with relationships. They struggle to understand, why people are making eye exchanges about them. They know I've said something wrong, but I don't know what it is. This is a thing that other people experience. But you're really frightened about, I don't want a thing. I don't want to be different. I don't want to stand out. Like, I've kind of programmed myself to blend in. So, yeah, all of that has really become what my book is about that, the kind of the raw collision of emotions and thoughts that you have when you're faced with this information later on in life, and how you get from that place of like, oh, I don't want this thing, but what is this thing, to actually, I'm proud to introduce myself as an autistic woman, and I want to be visible, because there wasn't enough people like me when I was growing up. I didn't know it was a thing. So yeah, as we kind of continue to talk through it, I think I now am aware of like some pretty big clues that were there along the way, and how they showed up in the workplace. And yeah, I want to do a lot more talking about those, because I think there's probably a lot of other late discovered or yet to discover neurodivergent folk who are trying their best to cover this stuff up.
So in Tim's episode, we had a stimulating debate over learnt response for social norms and masking, and where on the continuum does it become masking? So, us culturally, shaking people's hands in the morning because that's how this workplace say hello in them, versus, suppressing ourselves because there's a level of self-protectionism or something more going in there. So I think Tim landed on masking is self-harm in a way, because you're masking to the extent that it's painful, where doing things that are societally normal is a it is a learnt response which non-neurodistinct people also do. So to do something what a non-neurodistinct person does isn't masking, because everybody does it, and actually masking is only the extra bit that distinct people do because they want to have some level of protections.
Yes. Yeah, and I think as an autistic woman whose natural stance is speaking freely and truly and directly, that I was very aware of from a very young age. That is not acceptable behavior in girls and women. Like, no, because you're uttering the things that other people are thinking, but no one is saying. So it kind of puts you in quite a dangerous position. And to a certain degree, we all do that because we think it's the kind thing to do to Let's ignore that difficult thing that nobody wants to mention, or I'll just pretend that actually I'm enjoying this for the sake of the other person. But it is self-harm, and also it's not very like truthful and honest way to build a relationship. But it depends what the relationship is. If it's just someone you're never going to see again, or it's a colleague, then there has got to be a level of masking that protects the safety of the whole group. But it doesn't feel good as an autistic person to be that inauthentic. It can cause a lot of stress, because ultimately you're lying. So yeah, I think for me, became very aware of.
Then be strong words.
They are, but they're the truth, says she, the autistic woman. From the age of 8, I moved from Scotland to England, and that's when I first became very aware of actively masking, with just really subtle things like accent changes. But yeah, I definitely am a chameleon and have sort of camouflaged and mimicked a lot to blend into social groups and norms. So, and to a certain degree, we will all do that, particularly in the beginning at the forming stage of groupthink. But it's a lens, and that you're constantly having to preempt, okay, well, how do I need to behave in this group to not stand out? That neurotypicals don't have that level of energy investment they have to make in everyday life.
Where in Scotland's home?
I was born in Edinburgh and I grew up in Pennycook, so Mid Lothian.
No, I have a small place in my heart for Argyle, but
Yes,
let's
very beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've said on a couple of previous episodes, my background is overlooking Loch Awe at sunset last August when I was on top of a mountain taking a picture.
Wow.
So, yeah. There's just something awe-inspiring about the size of the place, just the scale. It's quite easy to feel oppressed when you're in a city and you've got all of these school buildings right on top of you. But when you're standing on the side of a hill, because it's not quite a mountain, or it could be a mountain because I haven't measured it. And it's 20 degrees and there's a bit of a breeze and you can see 20 miles. It's definitely special. Driving through Glencoe and just being like, this place is huge.
Yeah.
There's some special there. So you started masking because you didn't want to bring the twang down with you, although.
Yes, because I was getting attention that I couldn't cope with. So you've met one autistic or neurodivergent person, you've met one. We're all different, but I was incredibly quiet and shy as a child. I'm very observant and astute of kind of the dynamics when I could, watch from the safety of somewhere. But yeah, I definitely didn't want the attention of a group of people questioning why I spoke differently or why I used words that weren't kind of fitting with that kind of groupthink. So I mimicked their accent very quickly, and when I went through my kind of diagnosis for autism, I had to speak a lot to my mum about, my background. And I thought I had like a Scottish accent at home and an English accent at school for like years. She was like, it's only a matter of weeks. Because it was just like, well, who's going to take the mick out of me the most? It's like, okay, I can cope with my family, like, rolling their eyes at me. But I desperately need to fit to survive in this strange place that I don't know. So yes, that was the first sort of conscious masking that I did.
What I found is that my accent will change slightly, even in like a couple of weeks of going somewhere.
Yeah.
So I grew up in the flat countryside near Cambridge. And luckily I was brought up by my grandparents my grandmother who was from Bedfordshire and spoke RP. But my granddad and my granddad's family were farmers by trade. So, if you get too far out into the fens and into Norfolk and Suffolk, it starts to sound like the West Country because it's all just a little bit slower. So yeah, I get that. And my maternal grandmother was Scottish, so that's where all this red comes from.
I was wondering where your Scottish love came from. Yeah.
But it was actually my Bedfordshire grandmother that took us to Scotland because my maternal grandmother died about 3 months before I was born, so I never met her. But yeah, I'm a quarter Scot. I'm gonna stand by that.
Yeah, good for you.
And if I won the lottery, I'd have a house up there because
where you could see 20 miles ahead. Yeah.
Well, I can't think of anything nicer than being snowed in with like a month's worth of food. Just disconnect from the world and enjoy yourself. Just the peace and tranquility. As long as there's electricity and Wi-Fi, so we're not starving and freezing to death.
Yeah.
But I can but dream. So did you want to talk some more about fitting in at school or at work? What did your work life look like up until having the kids?
Yes, I will, because I think that that's helpful for people that might be curious or questioning their own kind of neurodivergence. So throughout life, but particularly at work. So I worked in fashion, fast fashion, Topshop, ASOS, and I liked being at work. I enjoyed sort of being able to apply my practical ideas. I could very quickly sort of look at things and think, well, that's not working. Well, if we did this, this, and this, then it would flow much better. So I thrived in a work setting, but as I progressed through the ranks, my levels of stress and anxiety became much greater because I was dealing with much more level of uncertainty, constant change, and particularly at the latter part of my career in Topshop and ASOS, it was fast. That's a very business model. So I was getting burnt out every 3 months. I would be, unwell, physically unwell, and just totally done in. And I constantly got feedback all the time of like, you're bright, you're switched on, you're capable, but you just need to manage your stress better. You just need to be better at sort of being more resilient and not showing your emotion, not showing it. And, so that is a very glaring big sign.
Just the word that uncovers so much.
Exactly. But so I always had this thing in me of like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just be calm? But it's because of my brain, because I didn't know that I'm autistic, and actually sensory processing takes up a lot of energy. And most of the time I felt like a shaken up Coke bottle. Like that's how my brain felt, that's how my body felt. And I was having to use a lot of energy, not only to process that, but to cover it up, because I was never going to be considered as successful or good or trusted or credible if I couldn't be calm and collected and think on my feet. Those are all things that are really tricky for neurodivergent human beings. So the environments I worked in were incredibly stressful, and I found it very difficult to kind of cover up. And I don't think I realised until I really kind of started to understand my autism how anxious I am. It does just come with being autistic. It doesn't mean that every autistic person experiences anxiety, but I've had to accept that autism and anxiety go together, and I have to manage that anxiety. And sometimes I can't. Like sometimes I wake up and it's roaring and it's crashing and it has me by the throat. And so I've a big part of this has been about learning to take care of myself, and saying, oh, okay, well, that's why that's hard. And I can't anticipate how it's going to be. But if I do this level of activity and I have to do this much talking or this much, being out in the world, I've got to have recovery time, because if I don't, but I didn't know that in those days. And there was a kind of a mantra that was going around when I was in these environments in the noughties, which was about being VUCA. You know it. That is just a shit show for the neurodivergent brain. You just like it, volatile, uncertain, quite complex and ambiguous. Complex you can kind of deal with, but the other three, it's like that is just stress and anxiety.
It's the interconnectivity of all four of those things at the same time. Any one of those on their own is manageable. And some people who are more logic based do quite well with complex because they can build it. But volatile and variance and uncertainty.
Exactly. And I could do really well with the complex. And actually, I'm very good at holding large conflicting conversations. One of my main things that I now know is a massive strength of being autistic is I can feel the emotions of others. Like I can't necessarily look at someone and think, oh, that's how they're thinking or feeling, but I've got a very strong emotional empathy. So I can feel and tune into atmospheres and and if I've created the right level of emotional, psychological safety, or I've got enough of a rapport with that person, I can ask the direct question, or I can hold this space and I can ask that question, but allow that person to listen and those to respond. So I could deal with a lot of that, but I wasn't having any recovery time because the pace of it was so kind of relentless. And it's sort of the language that are used in those environments. I'm sure it's different now. I'm out of it for 10 years, but it's all about getting carcasses on the table and fight and battle. And it felt like that. You're in those kind of environments. So yes, for anybody who is in a kind of VUCA environment or just in an environment where, it's chaotic, it is going to cause high levels of stress and anxiety. And that may be your biggest clue as to your kind of neurodivergence. So that's the first thing I'll share. The second thing that I really struggled with, and it's linked to the first one. So with anxiety, there's 4 typical responses. And my typical response was freeze, never fight at work, but that came out of work. But fawn was huge. And I think, the bias, particularly on females who are about building bridges and fixing things and being sociable and organized and all of those things, that was a typical anxiety response all the time. Like, okay, well, I'll mold and fit and reshape and adapt and do all these hours and whatever it takes to please you. So that only lasts so long, and when you're in a highly political environment, that is not going to get you very far. Relationships and RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, is that the right saying for it? That was a kind of a constant feed into my anxiety levels, the kind of perceived upsetting somebody or getting it wrong. And as you progress through the ranks, you have to lose that. And I couldn't, because it mattered to me how people felt, or it mattered to me how my impact or intentions or behaviors, what effect that has on someone. And there's no space for that when you're trying to kind of operate within a boardroom environment of most organizations. There has to be an element of doing things that are unpopular or pushing somebody off the edge to get yourself forward. So those things were incredibly difficult and stressful, and really caused me high levels of burnout towards the end of that career, because I just lost sight of who I was and what mattered. When you're just constantly taking short-term decisions for the good of the bottom line, it's soul destroying. So I would say that those were 2 of the biggest clues. And then the last one, which is a very obvious one, I don't know if many of your guests have talked about this, but autistic burnout. I had lots of short bursts of burnout, But yeah, as it really started to take its toll on me kind of mentally, by the end of my career in kind of fast VUCA environments, it took me kind of 5 years to recover from it, really. And I think that is one of the biggest kind of reasons that I want to speak out about it, and particularly with like women in leadership, to stop that from becoming something that can, you know, affect and damage their health in the long term. Because there's nothing wrong with them. They need to understand, in this wiring difference I have, these are the things that I'm amazing at, and I really struggle with these things. And actually, I need to be kind and compassionate about that, because I have to take care of myself in order to have a decent quality of life.
So what drove you to want to write a book about it?
So it wasn't like, oh, I'm autistic, finally I can write a book. Like, it was kind of, you know, I think it was a lot to do with the timing. So I first read the words that kind of, you know, collided and made me like realize, wow, this is a thing, in February 2020. And so then in March, obviously, all of our worlds totally changed, and we had a lot more time on our hands. Certainly once we gave up the battle of homeschooling or trying to function as we had done before, the world was quieter, and that was joyous in many aspects. You know, I think I've really realised quieter environments and being in nature is actually vital to me. But writing helped me to make sense of how I was feeling. And I've realised, even though as a coach, I ask lots of questions and I help people to identify their thoughts and emotions and get them unstuck. It's great. It's a privilege to do that. But actually, I need that for myself, because I don't really instantly understand how I feel. So I was writing a lot during those lockdown days to make sense of it all. And so through the kind of lockdown 1, 2, 3, it just started to become something that I was really loving, and words were pouring out, and it's like words would pop out the page. It'd be like, oh, that's what I think. Oh, well, that makes sense of that. So I didn't necessarily write a book in lockdown, but it became the beginning of recognizing that this could be useful to other people and helping them to make sense. So my book is not a manuscript, a memoir. It's not a memoir. It's not like, okay, well, here's another perspective on growing up autistic. It's a little bit of, well, this is a process that might happen as you start to discover your difference. You know, awareness is your first point of call. You ideally want to get to acceptance, but it's not a straight line. You kind of dance around it, and you have to look at some pretty big emotions, and there's a lot of grieving and a lot of letting go. So it's a book that shares some of my insights and experience, but it also turns to the reader and says, okay, well, over to you. Here's some thought-provoking questions. Here's some activities you might want to do that might help to illuminate your perspective on this. It's kind of like, and in the work I do, I guide people through that change. I'm kind of by their side. So that's what the book does, really. It helps late discovered men, women, you know, to privately go through this and make sense of it for themselves.
Do you feel like you belong?
That's a good question. I am starting to, Richard, and I am starting to. And I think the neurodivergent community is at a very interesting time at the moment. It's a sort of a clash of paradigms.
It's a community?
Probably not entirely, but I've had some of the most intimate and heartwarming conversations that I've ever had with autistic women, either like, you know, in the background on social media, or people come to me and they say, oh God, I'd really like to talk to someone about this. Can I talk to you? So Probably not. I don't see myself as being part of like millions of people, but slowly I'm gathering people towards me that we have shared values and we can create a space of going, oh God, did you have that? I didn't have that. That's not my experience, but this is what I had. So I think it's got a long way to go, but I think there is some comfort in being able to freely share. Like, for example, I've recently met somebody in Brighton quite randomly down at the sea, and we just went really deep into a conversation straight away. And that you can do with neurodivergent people, I think, or certainly autistic people. That's my experience, because you don't necessarily want to go straight into the small talk. And we're forming like a really lovely relationship. But it's nice to be able to communicate in ways that work for you and you're not having to adapt. So yes, I'm starting to feel like I belong, and I'm starting to find my people, and I'm starting to find my voice. And I'm speaking out. I have to advocate for my son a lot. I have to speak out about the, discrimination that goes on in education and the changes that I want to see. And that brings, a lot of like-minded people that are around you that have those feelings, and they want to drive that positive change. So within those pockets, I feel belonging. And I think the thing I probably initially set out to do from that very first and sort of awareness point was I wanted there to be a big like, oh, and you're autistic and we accept you, and this is great. But that's not how life is. So families and friends will react quite, they won't always give you the reaction or the response that you're looking for. And through the process of writing this, and the work that I do as a coach, like belonging, I think, has to come from self-acceptance. You're not going to get a certificate that tells you, yeah, you're part of the gang now. It's like you have to feel that acceptance from within in order to really show up as your true self, and not, I still mask to a degree, yes, because there's some places it's psychologically safe for me to go deep into that conversation straight away, and there's some places it very clearly isn't, and I've had to unravel that as I went through this kind of exploration of accepting myself as autistic. Okay, well, that place, I choose to be a part of it because of history, but it's not safe for me to show them my dislike of something or my strong opinions, or to be like, why did you buy me that gift? That's ridiculous. Like, I'm going to have to mask that to survive in that kind of dynamic. So yeah.
I think that there's a lot to say about the benefits of candor. So I was chatting to Ed Dupree in a previous episode, and he did some work with some Nordic countries, and apparently the Nordic word for small talk translates to dead talk because it's pointless. It's completely worthless. So being able to have big conversations involving big thoughts and feelings and emotions actually means that you can progress your thoughts or understanding or belief structure, because you're actually putting yourself on that edge of discomfort. You're in a learning zone. Here we go. Let's talk more psychological safety paradigm conversations. So you have to be okay with feeling not okay.
Yes.
And I think sometimes people use their label as a reason not to want to feel uncomfortable. And I think the world is moving to a stage where acceptance is more important than understanding. And then we end up with a level of entitlement where people are demanding that they feel heard. but they haven't given the air or room or opportunity for somebody to understand without necessarily believing the truth or their truth. And I think that's a challenging dichotomy to work from, because you've got all of these people who want to feel belonging, but might not necessarily want to put the effort in helping other people understand.
I think the key word I pick up from there, Richard, and totally agree with you on, is discomfort. I think it's about the level of discomfort that someone is prepared to endure, and they might go to great lengths to stop that discomfort from happening. So whether it's turning it on you, or, you know, doing all of that Machiavellian stuff in the background to skirt around it, but, you know, politics. So I think that's something you don't have a choice in when you're neurodivergent. You live with a level of discomfort from a very young age, because there was always something in me that I felt different, but I didn't have a language for it. So you can be surrounded by, you know, some of your closest friends and feel totally alone because you don't have the words to explain, oh my God, like this sensory overload. I'm really struggling to be present, or I don't know. And it makes you feel remote and isolated from people. So yeah, I think I had to get comfortable with navigating a level of discomfort from a very early age, but not only navigating it, covering it up. So yes, I think, and there's also this sort of the belonging, which is a charade, really, just like it's a popularity contest, and it looks like you belong if you're chosen by the person who's kind of heading that group to belong. But that's not real belonging. That's about fitting, isn't it? I think that's the difference. For me, belonging is about when you feel it's all right to be uncomfortable.
I think it's the difference between finding your place instead of being put in a place.
Yes, exactly. Oh, I like that.
You see,
but that's what we can often feel as we grow up. And if there isn't an environment where neurodivergence belongs, or it's like welcome to be there, then you're never going to be picked to have a place. And that's of course what happens is exclusion.
Or you end up with a clique. So you're on a list because somebody else on that list, or the master of the list, wants you on a list. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have an affinity or a culture or skills match or belief structure that is anywhere close to anybody else on that list. You're only on the list because somebody put you there. And it's amazing how we talk about the neurodiversity paradigm, movement, and community almost synonymously, but we're very segregated. We are so diverse that we argue with each other a lot. And there's so much variance in traits within the community that you can understand why they're at loggerheads, because we've got unemotional, logical people. We've got highly emotional, logical people. We've got highly emotional, empathetic, impulsive people. We've got highly emotional, pathologically demanding, avoiding people. And we've got emotional RSD people.
And all of those different people have probably experienced high levels of trauma throughout their lives because they've been messaged from a very early age that they're wrong.
Yes, and I find on social media there's quite a lot of infighting over definitions. I was like, look, the guy on the street doesn't know the difference between neurodistinct, neurospicy, neurodivergent, neurodiverse, and neurodiversity. So why are we arguing about the semantics of 5 words when, if you go and ask anybody about neurodiversity, they will talk to you about autism, dyslexia, ADHD. Maybe a couple of others.
I'm with you. And I think when you fought to be heard and taken seriously, then it can be that becomes a very important thing to you, is about getting it right and being accurate. So there's a lot in there. And is it ever going to be one big happy family? No. And but it is just about creating the right space to be heard, as you said, to like accept, well, these are the conditions in which belonging can happen, and there is going to be discomfort, but it's about everybody having the right to be there rather than just the chosen few.
Well, then we get into the conversation of, well, who's everybody? And actually, in the inclusion conversation, is inclusion more about creating a psychologically safe space for the people involved to talk, or is inclusion about letting everybody talk? Because I don't think the second's possible, because there's 8 billion people on the planet. And if everybody was wholly inclusive, then every company would have 8 billion employees. Every country would have 8 billion citizens.
Yeah.
And I'd have 4 billion wives. But in Huxley's Brave New World, I'd also have 4 billion husbands.
Yes. Wow. So it's blowing our mind. Let's just bring it back down to
Well, so for me, the conversation about accessibility, inclusion, and diversity needs to be brought back to reality. That there was a post on social media this last week to say, hypocritical companies saying that they're inclusive whilst not being accessible to all. Well, you can't be accessible to all. You're speaking in English. Okay, so all of those people who can't understand English, you've excluded. So you're automatically not accessible to all of those other people because you've written this in English. Okay, you put it on one social media platform. Well, what about the other billions of people who don't have access to that social media platform? What about all those billions of people who don't have regular internet access or electricity or all of this other stuff? So for me, I think inclusion is far more about allowing the people that you have the psychological safety to be honest and have the big talk conversations that they need to have. And sometimes that means that you're going to have conversations without the right representation or without the desirable representation. But at least you're having the conversation. I'd much rather 10 white men talk about women's issues than nobody talk about women's issues. So if the choice is nobody talks about it or 10 white men talk about it, I'd rather 10 white men talk about it. But ideally, we'd want a representative group of all of the minorities involved in the conversation so we can get a more well-rounded conversation. But we can't have 4 billion women involved in that conversation because it's too big a conversation to have.
The start point has always got to be, I think, who's not in the room or who isn't here or who are you missing. It's got to be that curiosity and that inquisitiveness, that you're not starting from a place of rightness, that there's always work to be done and you can always look at it from different perspectives.
But how do you add that perspective?
It's never going to be perfect.
That person?
I suppose it's like looking outwards, isn't it? It's just like not being so insular that you're just constantly looking around and thinking you've got it right. And I think it's accepting that it's never going to be right. Like, we're human. We can't always, it's never going to be like, and that is part of kind of neurodivergent makeup of some of us, is that sort of looking at it for everything to fit and be right and for it to make logical sense. So go back to your...
if it can never be perfect, what's the point in striving for perfection?
I don't think we should.
Ooh.
I don't think we should strive for perfection. Yeah, we shouldn't strive for perfection because that's flawed from the very outset. Because what is perfect? Surely we're messy, we're tangled. We should allow ourselves the kind of freedom of creativity and to make mistakes, to get it wrong. but to, and also to say, do you know what, I messed up there, I'm sorry, like I'm human. Like I don't think perfection should ever be a start point
Well,
or an
so
end point.
so then you could argue that perfection is more about the drive to betterment than it is
Yeah,
an end result.
but yeah,
So
I think if
so
you
so
want
go on.
something to be better, that's just like you constantly know that you can take input from other places or keep questioning and looking at it and listening. That to me is like, we can all do that, can't we? We can all grow. It's like a constant
Well,
thing.
then it's
There's
just the
not a
scientific method.
destination.
It's looking at evidence from multiple sources and getting the best guess of the way forward based on the evidence I have.
Yeah, or your instincts or feeling into something. But I think it's always got to be with a kind of receptiveness to input from others, or just to stop and pause and look at it and not be like, we all need to make decisions. We can't all kind of mull it over. But as an autistic woman, I can't ever switch my brain off. I'm constantly thinking. It is like endless. But there has to be times where it's like, okay, just trust my instincts and I've got to go with this. Or I need a bit longer to think about that. It doesn't feel right. There's something. So my data point is kind of how I feel and connect with the world. That's ultimately, all I've got as a way forward is to trust that I'm sort of tuning in on the right stuff and I'm listening. And yeah, we've gone way off on a tangent here, haven't we, with like the rights and wrongs and perfection and belonging. But
So this is the challenge of ADHD traits versus autistic traits.
yeah,
It's like
yeah,
we have a structure, we are in a
yeah,
box, and I'm like,
yeah,
we're on the edge of the box. We're still in
yeah.
the box.
I'm well used to working with that. So what I realize now, I don't have any scientific, but working in creative industries, you're working with a whole lot of neurodivergent folk who are like, oh, look at that, look at that, look at that. And I don't want to, VUCA is definitely not where I want to go back to, but that's quite fun, that experimental, you know, but it's knowing, I guess, how to bring it back into a framework where you don't just kind of go off like this forever. There's got to be some gathering and some kind of formulation of all of those brilliant ideas. But yeah, A, B,
Well,
C, D is not necessarily the way I like to live life.
yeah, and sometimes alphabety spaghetti is just delicious, and it doesn't have
Yeah.
to be alphabetized into
Yeah.
the formula that we want at the back end of it.
Yeah.
So when's the book coming out, or are you still typing?
No. So the book is going to be published by Jessica Kingsley Publishing. It's written. It's just gone into production. This is my first book, so I don't really know what that means, other than it will go through a process of the kind of copy edits, so all the kind of grammar and punctuations, getting a cover designed. So hopefully it will be out spring 2024. And yeah, I absolutely love the process of writing, and that's been the shift in the sort of where am I after I've discovered that I'm autistic. My discovery has really helped me to become a writer, and it's that creative output there. So I'm working on ideas for my next one. But the first one, which is aimed at kind of late discovered autists who are trying to make sense of it all, and want to go through a process of just grieving and letting go and getting to that, like, okay, well, I can accept that this is part of me. That will be out in spring next year.
So did you always have an affinity with writing, or that came to you after your later diagnosis?
I've always loved writing, and so I always used to get feedback. I used to have to write board reports and cost proposals and blah 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 blah, and I was always get feedback like, oh, you're quite flowery in your language. So I think I've always loved to express myself through writing, but it was never really an outlet that I seriously thought about until kind of it just became a lifeline for me through this pandemic autism discovery phase. But yeah, I have always loved it, and like, I love words, and I love what just emerges when you write. And talking takes a lot of energy as an autistic woman. I don't know if you find the same being neurodivergent, but there's a freedom in the written. It comes with ease.
I'm dyslexic as well, so
yeah.
I type quicker than I write. I can actually read what I type. So every episode, I've got a big Oxford black and red, and every episode I take notes. So that's my notes from Ed's.
Yeah.
And I sat down to edit it this morning, and I just stared at the page, and it's school that looks like it's spelt skol.
Yep.
I was just like, how am I reading this?
But can you make sense of it?
And ups and downs. Well, sometimes I can. And then whose was I reading? I was reading somebody else's, and I was just like, that's not even a word. So what I do during the conversation, somebody says something poignant, and I find that and I snag that as a quote, and then that's the title card.
Yeah.
So I scribbled down, I'm something in something. I was like, I can't even. I give up. And then that way I have to listen back to the whole episode before I edit it or make the title card, because I'm like, well, I wrote something, but I can't remember what was said.
Yeah.
I can't read what I wrote.
Are you visual though, Richard? Does visual kind of prompts work for you better, like drawing or colours or?
Well, I've been used to using symbols and diagrams.
Yeah.
So I don't write positive. I write plus VE, because in my brain that's positive, or just up.
Yeah.
We've got improving chronic illness is chronic illness with an up arrow.
Yeah.
Because my level of shorthand. But I'm writing. I've got to write somewhere in the region of 25,000 words for my coaching qual. I wrote 7,000 for the first piece of 3. And that took me nearly a year. I started the 20-something of September last year. No, I think it was over a year. I started like the 27th of September, and I submitted it on the 1st of October. So it took me a year to write 7,000 words.
Yeah.
It's just, it's ridiculous. And partly that's some procrastination, because I really hate writing.
Yeah. Or what would it be like if you could communicate your thoughts and ideas in a way that wasn't in written, like a coaching company? Can you please make that a bit more accessible?
Well, so I've got the possibility of presenting, so I can talk people through stuff.
Yeah.
That's cool. Or spider diagrams, star charts, and I've got all of this other way of doing it.
Yeah.
Last year, as I started the qual, I was like, well, although there are other methods of submission, the standard submission is a written submission.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I got access to the marking guide, and I broke down all of the categories into questions, and then just wrote like 400 words per question, and then that rolled up to 6,700 words.
So you've got your way of doing it, but yes, I think it is those kind of things that wouldn't, perhaps being a little bit like, seeing the world in a sunny, great light. But I would love for there to be methods of conveying our ideas that, are neurodivergent friendly and make it easier, so you're not constantly having to find the energy to hack it or cut it up and doing it in ways that are not natural to you.
Yeah. And this is kind of the challenge for coursework or exam-based qualifications, is that you have to be able to sit down and write it. At least in modern foreign languages at school, you got to do an oral exam.
Secondary education totally needs to be ripped up and started again. I mean, what are we preparing these people for? Does the world even need those? Do
I have the
you?
correct answer. So the modern education establishment was developed by the Prussians in the 18th century to make obedient workers and soldiers.
Totally.
And
Compliance.
250 years later, we've
Yeah.
got a bunch of self-entitled kids who don't take instruction. How did that happen? Or maybe they fought back against the machine.
but what, what is the byproduct of compliance? Like, does the world need more compliance, or does it need curiosity and interesting ways of looking at things?
This might be more of a political stance than we want to get into on a neurodiversity podcast.
Yeah.
But there are always those people who can control the narrative. And if they've got people who do as they're told, it's easier to control the narrative.
Totally.
That can be anything between this person should be locked in an asylum because they're weird, all the way through to you should take this drug to save your gran, to whatever else you want to control.
Yeah, and that's why we're at such an interesting point, and because there's so much resistance to us being funneled through these systems. Like, just taking education as an example, there's so many children that can't get into school, and particularly after post-COVID, because they've had a flavour of learning in a way that works for them. So
or they had effectively a year and a half off learning.
Yeah.
And then they're like, well, I don't want to learn anymore, thanks.
Well, I don't want to learn by sitting in a classroom with someone talking at me. So, I think...
Yeah, I've been a strong advocate of Kirsten and Kate, the two founders of Gaia Learning. So they are parents of ADHD kids.
Yeah.
And set up a school, an online school, to teach kids who have rejected school. And there's an umbrella company called Hybrid School, and that goes around the world and sets up online schools for real schools. So those kids that can't come to school today because their car broke down, or they're having their own crisis or meltdown or burnout or whatever, they can still access learning. And they're going through some seed funding now to grow, because they've got a handful of students. They're running a full-time program, but they want to do much more. They've won loads of awards, really good bunch of people. And the whole ethos there is trying to find a learning style that actually works, and it's not visual, action, audible, kinesthetic, and there is a fourth, but everyone refers to the three. But actually, there's a blend. I for my coaching call, my trainer wanted to know my learning style, so had me do the VAC. And I'm pretty even over all three. And they're like, I've never had this. And I was like, well, because I'm special. And it's doing things in an action-oriented way, to me, makes sense, because you're actually doing the thing. It's quite easy to teach somebody to do a thing by doing the thing. But because I'm different, means that I've had all of these other ways of trying to communicate, which means that I've developed all of these learned responses and ways of working. That means that I can draw a diagram and somebody will get it, or I can talk to somebody about it without having access to a picture, or I can physically walk them through the thing. Although, ironically, for loads of the visual stuff, I'll draw a diagram and then just talk through the diagram that I've drawn. So you can't see the diagram, but I know the diagram.
Yeah. And you've got that in your mind, and so you can access that information again quickly.
Yeah. And one of the challenges that I have is the sponge analogy. My sponge is full of useless information. So when you want to retrieve something of importance, it's saturated with bullshit, which isn't very helpful unless you run a quiz. So this last week we did a quiz for the Scouts. We raised £1,000. It was a good night. I didn't play because I'm chairman of the group, and if the chairman's team won, then all hell would break loose.
Well, yeah.
But the young farmers had a table, and they were 30 points behind anybody else. So I just sat with them for 4 questions, and I was like, yeah, good. Well, they scored 7 that round instead of 4. So I did my bit. They came dead last. Okay, it's not like I affected the results. But it's all a little bit crazy, and you're right. We need to get to a stage where we're developing people to interact with the VUCA world, because we don't know what the future is going to be in 10 or 50 years. I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson on Joe Rogan's podcast, and talking about how quickly the shift from horses to cars in New York was, and how quickly that could happen between cars and the next thing. And that might be fully autonomous electric vehicles. That might be, who knows? A whole industry died in 3 years because everyone went, well, hang on a second, it's cheaper to own a car than it is a horse, and we don't have to deal with it dying or it making a mess or feeding it. So I think that's part of the challenge that we're facing, is that the world could be vastly different in 20 years' time, and the kids that are leaving school now have the skills for 10 years ago. And
totally.
We're just about good enough to use those skills now, but in the workplace they're going off and doing vocational training on the specialism because the schools aren't geared up enough to move them that way.
Yeah.
Or you end up with people stuck in the education system because they don't want to get a proper job, because they're addicted to learning rather than addicted to doing.
But if it had the right environment and the right output, how amazing could that love of learning be for others? So yeah, I think I am hopeful that things will change in the future, but there is definitely a systemic stuckness across every kind of education, health, law, all of those things that are barriers to neurodivergent people, and what a lot of talent is being wasted, and what a lot of fulfillment is not accessed because of this blocks that we have.
I think there should be a royal commission for education and healthcare, and they shouldn't keep playing with it as a political animal.
Yes.
We've had the NHS for 70 odd years. Maybe we should not screw it over.
Yeah.
But somebody the other day I was listening to applauded Michael Gove's amendments to the education system in the early 2000s, or 2012, 2015. I was like, he didn't really do much. He changed GCSEs from letters to numbers. He got rid of coursework and put it all on exams, and made T-levels. That's, you could argue the apprenticeship stuff's been good, and given access to smaller organisations to effectively get free or very, very cheap training. But yeah, I think the way that we educate people is fundamentally, it doesn't take us in the right direction.
It doesn't, and I think it's the sort of areas we're both curious about is that, so how can we help the sort of neurodivergent people, humans, to A, understand, and B, to open stuff up so that they are let in and they skills are utilized in the right way. They're so closely linked, aren't they? I don't know what comes first, which we need to free first, but I think that is why podcasts such as this, with a variety of different conversations and perspectives from neurodivergent people, will just shift perspectives of stereotypical views of what it looks like or feels like or how it's limited, and to see the possibilities. That's what I hope comes from conversations like these.
So we've been going about an hour. You need to run away soon for school runs.
I do.
I need to have lunch.
Oh goodness.
2:30 in the afternoon.
You're getting hangry. Are you in the hangry zone? That's dangerous.
Well, the problem is that I have a belly, but I don't have a belly because I eat bad food. I have a belly because I'm constantly in starvation mode, because I eat dinner at 6 and then don't eat until 4 the next day. And then my body's like, this is food. We should store it because you might be hungry. So yeah, I'm not hungry. I'm not hangry. I just know that all I've had since 6 o'clock last night is a mulla corner yogurt.
Okay.
Now, okay, it was the strawberry cheesecake version, so it's like biscuit with white chocolate in a strawberry. Yeah. Anyway, it was tasty. So what we tend to ask at the end of the conversation is there anything today you haven't talked about that you wanted to talk about? And we've bounced over some bits. We've gone to the edge of our box. But yeah, there might be some stuff on your prep notes that you really wanted to talk about that we haven't given airtime to.
No, I think I've probably covered everything really, and just like you, I'm passionate about just positive change happening for this community, not community, bunch of people who are wired differently. And I think, I would really like, particularly because I'm a woman and I've got experience of masking and covering it up, for women who are really bewildered and exhausted in workplaces up and down the land, to know that, there might be some pretty clear clues as to why the struggles that you have are such big struggles. So there is joy to be had in embracing a difference in you, and it is that you can just take care of yourself better, and you can be more compassionate about how you show up in the world, and waste less energy on thinking you're wrong, and just understanding yourself. So don't be afraid of the label. It can be liberating if you kind of just let yourself look at it with curiosity.
And I think that there's something there about knowing the label but not necessarily using the label. I can now understand why the sky is blue, but I don't have to go around telling everybody the sky's blue, because they might know it's already blue, or they might not care, or etc. Part of the debate that I constantly have with my wife is the balance between reasons and excuses. I don't want to be in an excuse world. You make decisions, and those decisions have outcomes, and there are reasons for those decisions and those outcomes. And that's not to say it's right or wrong, because that's a whole other debate about changing terminology and rewiring the language that we use to move away from fault and blame. Because if it's wrong, then somebody's done wrong, and if somebody's done wrong, then they're at fault. It's not necessarily a useful phrase book. But if we talk about the reasons behind why the decision was made, and the reasons why that decision led to the outcome, then we can see whether or not that was the outcome we wanted, and what we could have done differently to get a better outcome.
Definitely. So it's about really using this information to develop an understanding of yourself and others. And that is where the kind of medical model and the pathology of our brains leads to the sort of the deficiencies in the deficit base that can create that kind of blaming language, or feeling wrong, or having to justify. So I think we're both of the same kind of thinking, that it can be positive if it's used to understand humans better.
And there's a lot of negative connotations, especially with ADHD and autism. Tourette's to a similar extent, but probably not as harshly. Talking to Tim in his episode about the word nerd. So in the UK, a nerd is kind of like a geek with more specialism, as in the US, a nerd is a derogatory term for somebody who's a little too into what they're into. So sometimes it's useful to know why, but not necessarily use those words. So I talk about my difference, but I don't necessarily label all of my differences, because some of the differences I have stigma attached to the labels used to talk about that. And I am me. I am Marmite, and luckily, I think 80% of people get on with me. It might be 90, but I certainly remember a time when somebody thought it was 30. I went for a promotion once, and somebody said, "Well, but you piss off half our customers," and I was like, "50%." It might be 30%, but 50%. But customers who like me really like me.
Yeah.
But why?
Spiky profile.
Why do they really like me? Or are they a little bit distinct themselves?
Yes.
Or are they seeing something that somebody else isn't? So, talking about the atrocities going on in the world, context is king. And actually, if you can look at something from a different perspective and understand it in the widest possible context, then you can say, well, all harm is bad, except for the harm that does good. Okay. But the harm can be bad and good at the same time. One of my favorite sayings is, a calm sea never made a good sailor. Now, if you wanted to go on a boat around the world, would you want to go on a boat with somebody who's sailed in storms and knows how to sail, or somebody who sailed on a lake? Well, I'd rather sail with the guy who knows how to deal with a storm on the sea, because he's done it before. And from bad situations can come good things. We can be more resilient, stronger people who are more self-aware because of what we've been through. So sometimes the hurt and harm has a silver lining.
I agree. I would like the change so that there's more understanding about the storm conditions from everybody, so that the quality of lives of the sailor who's sailed a million storms, he can live longer and happier, and he's not battered by the end of it. So yes, I think we all, we are all going to have hard knocks and difficult lessons that shape us, but it's the cost of those, if they are not understood, they're much greater, aren't they?
Well, and the other adjoined saying, I saw this on a London Underground notice board. We're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, some of us are in super yachts, some of us are in kayaks, and some of us are swimming.
Yeah. Some of us don't. Exactly. We don't even have a life jacket, mate.
So, I think there's definitely something to be said about supporting those most in need. Okay, well, then how do you define need? And this was part of the conversation I was having with Tim on his episode. Is somebody in the third world struggling with the same types of things that I'm struggling with, who deserves support, or the same level of support, or more or less support? And part of that conversation was like, well, if you had a comparator of the normative way of living for that individual, then you could argue that you only require support to get to your normative standard rather than the better standard. So part of that conversation was looking at wealth disparity and health outcomes and that kind of stuff. So if you are a nomad and you're burning whatever you can find to cook your dinner, and your life expectancy is 60, or you're white middle class in a first world country, both of you might struggle with rejection sensitivity. Both of you might struggle with executive function. Both of you might struggle with But what's needed for the nomad to fit in with the rest of their tribe would require a much lower level of support than the working class person to go to work and be productive, because of what's going on around them. So I think that there may be a place for a needs-based conversation, but the reasonableness of the need being situation, being context-driven. because a nomad without electricity doesn't need noise cancelling headphones.
No.
Because you can't charge them.
Yeah.
Now, they might do well with those like flare audio. I don't know how they work, but they're like little cones, and you put them in your ear, and then all of a sudden you can hear better.
Yeah.
But they're tech free. They're like, anyway, I got given a set. I used them for about 4 hours, and I put them back in the thing, and I haven't taken them out again. I don't know why. I think it said, use it for 8 hours first, and then after a few days of wearing them, you'll feel the benefits. I was like, yeah, but I just look a little bit silly, and they feel weird in my ears. So I
forget about those. Yeah.
Nah. And I wear headphones. These headphones I've had since 2019, and I wear them about 8 hours every day. And I listen to YouTube. I have video calls. I listen to music. I think I need to change like the headphones. It's starting to get a bit ropey, but Anyway, we've waffled. But yeah, thanks very much for coming on.
No, thank you for inviting me. And let's keep in touch, because if I can help in any way or any interesting stuff comes. But it's been a real pleasure to chat to you for an hour and a bit, and you definitely need to go and get some lunch, Richard.